At 40 years old, Charlotte Craig stood in a ballroom where whispers called her a failure, a cautionary tale, a woman who should have disappeared years ago. Then, the Duke of Ravensmore, the most desired man in all of Scotland, stopped mid-conversation, locked eyes with her across the crowded room, and began walking directly toward her. The entire assembly fell silent. Scotland, 1862. Victorian-era. The crystal chandeliers of the Glenwood ballroom hung like frozen stars above a sea of rustling silk and polished superficiality. Charlotte had positioned herself near a towering arrangement of white roses, a strategic location that allowed her to observe without being observed, or so she thought. "My dear, have you seen?" Lady Ashford's voice carried through the perfumed air with deliberate volume. "Miss Craig has graced us with her presence yet again. One would think after 20 years on the shelf she might spare herself and us the discomfort of her continued attendance." The words struck like a physical blow, but Charlotte's expression remained serene. She smoothed the ivory silk of her gown, a shade that straddled the line between youth and resignation, and kept her gaze fixed on the dancers as if she hadn't heard every cutting syllable. At 40, Charlotte had become intimately acquainted with such cruelty. The spinster of the once respected Craig family, she had watched her younger sister Margaret marry at 22, had seen childhood friends settle into respectable marriages and motherhood, had felt society's warmth slowly cool into something between sympathy and disdain. "Charlotte," came her brother William's voice beside her, weighted with familiar concern. "You seem rather isolated. Shall we take a turn about the room?" "I'm perfectly content, William," she replied, her practiced smile firmly in place. "I was simply admiring the evening's festivities." William's brow furrowed. "You needn't subject yourself to these events." "No one would fault you if I were to withdraw from society entirely?" she interrupted, a spark of steel flashing in her hazel eyes. "Become the reclusive aunt who appears only for weddings and funerals? No, brother, I may not have secured a husband, but I will not be erased." She had barely finished speaking when she felt it, a shift in the atmosphere, a sudden tension that rippled through the ballroom like electricity before a storm. Brogan Walker, Duke of Ravensmore, stood near the refreshment table, a glass of champagne untouched in his hand. He had been listening with barely concealed boredom to Lord Hamilton's discussion of parliamentary matters, when his gaze drifted across the assembly and stopped. On a woman in ivory silk, standing alone near the white roses, with her spine straight and her chin lifted in quiet defiance, even as cruelty was being whispered about her mere feet away. There was something in her posture, a dignity that didn't beg for validation, a strength that didn't need an audience. While every other woman in the room postured and performed, this one simply was. The Duke set down his glass. "Excuse me, Hamilton," he said quietly, and began walking. The crowd noticed immediately. Conversations faltered, fans froze mid-flutter. The string quartet's music seemed to soften, as if even the musicians sensed something momentous occurring. "Good God," William breathed beside Charlotte. "He's coming this way." Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs. She told herself it was impossible, that the Duke must be heading towards someone behind her, that this couldn't possibly be happening. But his dark eyes never wavered from hers, and with each step he took, the whispers grew louder. Is he truly walking toward Miss Craig, the spinster, at her age? Lady Ashford's mouth fell open in undisguised shock. Debutantes stared in confusion, and Charlotte Craig, the 40-year-old woman whom society had long since dismissed, stood rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the man who was about to shatter every assumption she'd ever made about her life. The Duke of Ravensmore stopped directly before her, ignoring the collective gasp that rippled through the ballroom. He bowed with perfect formality, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Miss Craig," he said, his voice low and certain, cutting through the stunned silence, "would you do me the honor of this waltz?" The world tilted on its axis. And Charlotte Craig, for the first time in 20 years, felt truly, impossibly seen. Charlotte's hand trembled as she extended it, certain this must be some elaborate cruelty, a jest meant to remind her of her place. But the Duke's fingers closed around hers with unmistakable warmth, steady and real, and suddenly she was being led onto the dance floor, while 300 pairs of eyes followed her every step. The orchestra hesitated just long enough to feel the weight of what was unfolding before the waltz began. Brogan's hand settled at her waist with perfect propriety, yet the contact sent a jolt through her, sharp and disorienting. She forced herself to breathe, to stand tall, to remember how one was meant to move in a room designed to break women like her. When she finally met his gaze, she faltered. There was no mockery there, no condescension, only an unsettling attentiveness, as though he were measuring not her worth, but her courage. "You were afraid," he said quietly as they turned, his voice meant for her alone. "I would be a fool not to be," Charlotte replied, surprised by her own honesty. "Men do not ask women like me to dance, not without a reason." A faint smile touched his mouth, not amused, but thoughtful. "Then allow me to be foolish." They moved together with a grace that felt unreal, as though the room had narrowed to the steady rhythm beneath her feet and the firm certainty of his hand guiding her. Charlotte was acutely aware of every gaze, every whisper blooming behind fans, yet for the first time in years she did not feel diminished by them. "I have spent much of my life being looked at," Brogan continued, "and very little of it being seen. Tonight, I found the distinction refreshing." Her heart stumbled. "You do not know me, Your Grace." "No," he agreed, "but I would like to." They passed familiar faces, some pale with outrage, others alight with scandalized curiosity. But Charlotte no longer searched them for judgment. Her world had narrowed to the man before her and the terrifying realization that she wanted this moment to last. The final notes faded. For a breathless instant, neither of them moved. Then Brogan released her and bowed, every inch the Duke once more, as if offering her the dignity of choice rather than spectacle. "May I call upon you tomorrow, Miss Craig?" The question hovered between them, dangerous and impossible. Charlotte felt the weight of it press against years of caution, years of restraint, years of survival. "Yes," she said, and in that single word, the ballroom erupted. Before we continue, ask yourself, do I want to be the person who watches, gets value, and leaves without subscribing? No? Then fix that right now. Hit subscribe. Your conscience will be clear, I promise. Charlotte woke to discover that one waltz had made her the most talked-about woman in Scotland. Sunlight streamed through her bedroom curtains, and with it came the distinct feeling that something monumental had shifted in the universe. For one blissful moment, she floated in that space between sleep and waking, where the previous evening might have been nothing more than an elaborate dream. Then her bedroom door flew open with enough force to rattle the hinges. "Charlotte!" Margaret burst in, still in her dressing gown, her young face flushed with excitement and alarm. She clutched what appeared to be half a dozen newspapers and several hastily scrawled notes. "Have you seen? You're in the scandal sheets, all of them." Charlotte sat up slowly, her heart sinking, even as a traitorous part of her thrilled at the confirmation that last night had been real. "What do they say?" Margaret dropped onto the bed, papers scattering around them like autumn leaves. "The Edinburgh Observer calls it the most shocking development of the season. Lady Ashford has apparently told everyone who will listen that the Duke must be ill or under some strange compulsion, and Mrs. Pemberton sent a note asking if you've somehow— Oh God, Charlotte, she actually asked if you've ensnared him through unnatural means." "Witchcraft," Charlotte said flatly. "She's accusing me of witchcraft."
Well, what else could explain why Scotland's most eligible bachelor would dance with a 40-year-old spin— Margaret caught herself, color flooding her cheeks. I didn't mean— It's what I am, Margaret. Charlotte's voice was gentler than her sister deserved. What everyone's been calling me for 20 years. At least now they're saying it with confusion instead of pity. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs announced William's arrival before he appeared in the doorway, his face thunderous. He'd clearly dressed in haste, his cravat askew, his hair uncombed. Charlotte, what in God's name happened last night? He didn't wait for an answer, pacing the small bedroom like a caged animal. The Duke of Ravensmore? Do you have any idea what people are saying? Half of Edinburgh thinks this is some cruel wager. The other half thinks you've somehow deceived him about your age or circumstances. William, you are vulnerable, Charlotte. He stopped pacing, and the anguish in his eyes cut deeper than any of last night's whispers. If he's toying with you, if this is some momentary fancy, or worse, some elaborate jest, the humiliation will be unbearable. I couldn't protect you from the mockery before, but this will destroy you. Charlotte opened her mouth to respond, to say she'd considered exactly that during the sleepless hours before dawn, when the voice of their housekeeper, Mrs. Murray, called up the stairs. "Miss Charlotte, there's a delivery." They found the arrangement in the front hall, and Charlotte's breath simply stopped. Scottish thistles, dozens of them, their purple blooms defiant and wild, mixed with deep violet heather that seemed to glow in the morning light. The arrangement was massive, unapologetic, bold. Margaret plucked the card from its holder with trembling fingers and read aloud, "For the woman who made me remember why I attend these tedious events, may I call upon you? R.W." William stared at the flowers, then at Charlotte, his fury draining into something like wonder. And Charlotte, despite everything, despite the scandal, despite the whispers, despite 20 years of learning not to hope, felt herself begin to smile. The Duke of Ravensmore arrived at 3 o'clock precisely, as his note had promised. Charlotte watched from the drawing-room window as his carriage pulled up, black lacquer gleaming in the afternoon sun, the ducal crest emblazoned on the door like a declaration of war against propriety. "You don't have to receive him," William said quietly from behind her. He'd stationed himself in the house like a sentry since the flowers arrived, protective and wary in equal measure. "Yes," Charlotte said, "I do." She met Brogan in the walled garden behind the townhouse, a small sanctuary of climbing roses and ancient stone, where her mother had once tended herbs. It seemed safer somehow than the formal drawing room, less confined, with clear paths of escape should this conversation prove as devastating as she feared. The Duke stood when she entered, his tall frame somehow both elegant and powerful in the dappled sunlight. He dressed simply, no excessive finery, no peacocking display of wealth, just a man in a well-tailored coat, watching her with those disconcertingly direct eyes. Charlotte didn't waste time on pleasantries. She'd spent 40 years learning that the cruelest cut was often the one you didn't see coming, and she refused to be blindsided. "Why me?" The words came out harder than she intended, sharpened by fear. "I'm not young. I'm not beautiful by society's measure. I have no fortune, no influential connections. So what game are you playing, Your Grace? Is this some wager, some elaborate jest at the spinster's expense?" Brogan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Not offense, but what looked almost like relief. "You think I would publicly humiliate a woman for sport? I think powerful men do incomprehensible things, and I refuse to be collateral damage in whatever this is." Charlotte crossed her arms, armor firmly in place. "So please enlighten me. Why single out the oldest, least eligible woman in that ballroom? May I be blunt, Miss Craig? I insist upon it." Brogan took a step closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, evidence that he too had weathered more years than the debutantes currently flooding the marriage market. "I'm 35 years old. For nearly 2 decades, I've been pursued by countless women who saw only my title and fortune. They looked at me and calculated how much pin money they'd receive, which estates they'd summer at, what jewels they'd wear to court. He paused, and Charlotte found herself unable to look away. But you looked at me last night, and I saw recognition in your eyes, as if you saw the man, not the Duke, as if you understood what it means to be reduced to a single defining characteristic and found wanting. That's rarer than any jewel in my family's collection. The honesty in his voice struck her like a physical blow. Charlotte felt her defenses waver, felt the dangerous warmth of hope beginning to kindle in her chest. That still doesn't explain. You stood there with cruelty being whispered about you, and you didn't flinch, didn't beg for validation or approval. You simply existed with a dignity that every simpering debutante in that ballroom was only performing. Brogan's gaze held hers with uncomfortable intensity. I've been looking for authenticity in a world of carefully constructed facades, and then I found you. Charlotte's throat tightened. Your Grace, Brogan, he said quietly. When we're alone, I'd like you to call me Brogan. And Charlotte Craig, who had spent 20 years building walls around her heart, felt the first stone begin to crumble.
The Dowager Duchess of Ravensmore stood in her son's study like a force of nature contained in black silk and diamonds. She had not been invited, but Genevieve Walker had never required invitations, not to her son's home, and certainly not to express her opinions. A 40-year-old spinster Brogan. Her voice could have cut glass. Have you taken leave of your senses? Brogan set down his pen with deliberate calm, though his jaw tightened. Miss Craig is a woman of intelligence and character. I would think you'd appreciate those qualities. I appreciate airs. The Dowager moved to the window overlooking the Edinburgh streets, her posture rigid with aristocratic displeasure. You need a young bride, someone who can provide the succession. At her age, Charlotte Craig is hardly likely to— That's enough. Steel entered Brogan's voice, the tone that made hardened lords in Parliament reconsider their positions. I won't discuss this further. Then you're a fool. His mother turned, and for the first time something like fear flickered beneath her anger. You'll be a laughingstock, the Duke who chose the oldest woman in Scotland when he could have had any fresh young beauty. They'll say you've gone mad, or worse. Before Brogan could respond, Lord Cameron was announced. His oldest friend entered with the easy confidence of someone who'd known him since Eton, but his expression was troubled. Brogan, a word? The Dowager swept past Cameron with a withering look, leaving the two men alone. Let me guess, Brogan said dryly. You're here to save me from myself. Cameron had the grace to look uncomfortable. I'm here because I care about you. The scandal is everywhere. The betting books at White's have odds on how long this infatuation will last. They're calling her the Autumn Duchess in the broadsheets, and not kindly. Let them talk. They're saying you're having some sort of crisis, that you've chosen her out of spite, or exhaustion, or— Cameron stopped, running a hand through his hair. Brogan, are you certain? She's 40. That's not youth talking, it's arithmetic. Brogan's expression hardened into something dangerous. Get out. I'm trying to protect you. I don't need protection from the woman I'm courting. I need protection from so-called friends who can't see past a number to recognize genuine worth. Brogan stood, his considerable height suddenly intimidating. If you'll excuse me, I have a call to make. Across Edinburgh, Charlotte sat in Lady Ashford's drawing room, teacup trembling slightly in her hands. She'd known attending would be walking into a lion's den, but refusing the invitation would have been seen as cowardice, so she sat, spine straight, while barbed comments flew like arrows. How generous of the Duke to notice you, Miss Craig, Lady Ashford said, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. Perhaps he needs a companion for his elderly mother. The Dowager Duchess is getting on in years. You'd be perfect for such a position. Titters rippled through the assembled ladies like poison spreading through water. Or perhaps, added Mrs. Pemberton with false sweetness, he's conducting some sort of social experiment, testing how far novelty can compensate for other deficiencies. Charlotte set down her cup with exquisite precision. "If you'll excuse me, Lady Ashford, I've just remembered a prior engagement." She rose, gathered her reticule, and walked through the drawing-room with her head high. But once in the privacy of her carriage, Charlotte pressed shaking fingers to her temples. The cruel laughter echoed in her ears, the knowing smirks, the casual cruelty dressed in civility. Could she endure this, week after week, season after season, being the object of Edinburgh's mockery, while Brogan's interest inevitably cooled? Her heart, so recently awakened, felt bruised and bleeding. Perhaps William had been right. Perhaps some humiliations were simply unbearable.
Brogan arrived the next morning with a closed carriage and a determined expression that suggested he wouldn't accept refusal. Charlotte, still raw from Lady Ashford's tea party, nearly declined, but something in his eyes, a quiet plea beneath the aristocratic composure, made her reach for her shawl instead. They drove beyond Edinburgh's suffocating scrutiny into the rolling green hills, where the countryside opened like a secret being shared. The city's gossip couldn't follow them here, among ancient stones and wind-bent trees that had witnessed centuries of human folly and cared nothing for it. "Tell me about yourself," Brogan said, once they were miles from anyone who might report back to the scandal sheets. "Not the version society sees, the real Charlotte Craig." Charlotte found herself answering with an honesty that shocked her. They spoke of books. She confessed her secret love of Gothic novels. He admitted to reading poetry when no one was watching. They discussed art, politics, the small rebellions they'd each committed against the suffocating rules of their world. "I wanted to travel," Charlotte said, watching the landscape roll past. "After my first season produced no offers, I begged my father to let me go to Italy to study the Renaissance masters. He was horrified, said it would only make me more unmarriageable, too educated, too worldly. So I stayed and attended 20 more seasons and watched the world shrink around me." "It's not too late," Brogan said quietly. "Italy still exists." Charlotte laughed, but it caught in her throat. The casual way he spoke of futures she'd long ago stopped imagining made something ache in her chest. The silence stretched, comfortable and dangerous. Then Charlotte heard herself saying words she'd never spoken aloud to anyone. "I was engaged once." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. 20 years ago. His name was Thomas Hartley. He was the second son of an earl, handsome and charming, and I thought—" She stopped, the old wound still tender after all these years. "He courted me for an entire season, proposed at my family's estate. I was 20, and so desperately in love I couldn't see what everyone else apparently could." Brogan didn't interrupt, just listened with an intensity that made her feel truly heard. "A 17-year-old heiress came out the following season. Her father owned half of Lancashire. Thomas broke our engagement 3 weeks later." Charlotte's hands twisted in her lap. "I've been the cautionary tale ever since. The girl so undesirable, even an engaged man abandoned her." The carriage lurched slightly over a rut in the road. Then Brogan's hand covered hers, warm and solid and real. "Then every man since has been a fool." His voice held quiet ferocity. "Their loss is my extraordinary fortune." Charlotte looked up and found his dark eyes fixed on hers with an expression that stole her breath. Not pity, not charity, something far more dangerous, genuine desire, complicated by respect and deepening feeling. "Brogan?" "I mean it, Charlotte." He spoke her given name like a vow. "Every man who looked at you and saw only a number, only society's measuring stick, was blind. I look at you and see someone who survived 20 years of cruelty without becoming cruel. who maintained dignity when the world offered you none, who refused to disappear even when disappearing would have been easier. His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, and Charlotte felt tears threatening, not of sadness, but of something far more overwhelming. "I'm afraid," she whispered, "of hoping again, of believing this is real." "So am I," Brogan admitted, and the vulnerability in his voice shattered the last of her defenses. "But I'd rather be afraid with you than safe with anyone else." The countryside rolled past, ancient and indifferent, as Charlotte Craig allowed herself to believe in impossible things.
The Theatre Royal blazed with light and anticipation on the evening of the season's most acclaimed production of Macbeth. Charlotte had intended to decline Brogan's invitation. The theater meant public display, and she'd endured enough scrutiny to last a lifetime. But he'd sent a note that simply read, "Stand with me. Let them see we're not hiding." So she dressed in deep emerald silk that Margaret insisted brought out the gold in her hazel eyes, and tried to quiet the trembling in her hands as Brogan's carriage arrived. The moment they entered the theater, conversations died like candles being snuffed. Every head turned, every opera glass lifted. Charlotte felt the weight of hundreds of stares as Brogan offered his arm and led her, with deliberate slowness, up the grand staircase to the Duke's box, the most prominent position in the entire theater. "You're shaking," he murmured, so quietly only she could hear. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "Good, so am I." His hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. "But we're terrified together." The Duke's box sat at the perfect angle to see and be seen by the entire assembly. As they settled into the plush velvet seats, Charlotte felt the prickling awareness of every eye in the theater trained on them. In the box beside theirs, Lady Pembroke held court with her usual coterie of sharp-tongued socialites, their fans fluttering like predatory wings. The lights dimmed for the first act. Charlotte tried to focus on the stage, on the witch's prophecies and Macbeth's fatal ambition, but Lady Pembroke's voice carried clearly through the thin partition between boxes. "One must admire her persistence, I suppose," Lady Pembroke said, in a stage whisper designed to be overheard. "Desperate older women will go to extraordinary lengths to secure a title, though I do wonder how long such novelty can sustain his interest." Charlotte's breath caught. Her hands clenched in her lap, nails biting into her palms. She'd endured worse, she told herself. She could sit through this with dignity intact. But Brogan stood. The movement was so sudden, so deliberate, that it drew attention even from the stage. He turned to face not just Lady Pembroke's box, but the entire tier of the theater's elite seating. His voice, trained by years of addressing Parliament, carried with effortless authority. "I would remind everyone present," he said, each word precisely enunciated, "that Miss Craig possesses more grace, intelligence, and genuine character than any woman I've encountered in 2 decades of navigating society's carefully constructed performances." The theater had gone absolutely silent. Even the actors on stage seemed to have frozen. "She has endured 20 years of casual cruelty with a dignity that puts our so-called nobility to shame. She refuses to perform or pander or pretend to be anything other than exactly who she is." Brogan's gaze swept the assembled boxes, landing briefly on Lady Pembroke's mortified face. "I consider myself remarkably fortunate that she tolerates my company, and I would suggest that anyone who mistakes authenticity for desperation is revealing far more about their own character than hers." He sat back down, took Charlotte's trembling hand in his, and said clearly enough for their entire box to hear, "Now, where were we? Ah yes, the witch's prophecy. Fascinating how ambition can blind us to what truly matters." The silence held for one breathless moment. Then, from a box across the theater, someone began to clap, slowly at first, then joined by others. Not everyone. Lady Pembroke and her circle sat rigid with shock and fury. But enough to matter. Charlotte stared at Brogan, tears threatening to spill over.
He just publicly defended her honor before Edinburgh's entire elite, had made his intentions unmistakably clear, had chosen her, publicly and irrevocably, consequences be damned. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Brogan brought her gloved hand to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. Always. And Charlotte Craig felt the tide beginning to turn.
If this story resonated with you, subscribing is how you tell me to keep creating more like it. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it ensures you never miss the next chapter. Your support literally determines what I create next. The invitation arrived on heavy cream paper, sealed with the Ravensmore crest. Will you come to my home? I want you to see where I truly live, not just where I reside. The journey north took 2 days, the landscape growing wilder with each mile, until Edinburgh's refined streets gave way to mountains that clawed at storm-heavy skies. Ravensmore Castle emerged from the mist like something from a medieval legend, all gray stone battlements and narrow windows, perched on a cliff overlooking a black loch that reflected nothing but clouds. Charlotte's courage nearly failed her as the carriage passed through the massive iron gates. The Dowager Duchess received her in the great hall with impeccable civility that somehow felt colder than outright hostility. "Miss Craig, how unexpected to finally meet you." Her eyes assessed Charlotte with the precision of a general evaluating enemy forces. "I trust your journey was tolerable?" "It was beautiful, Your Grace," Charlotte replied, keeping her voice steady despite the intimidating surroundings. Suits of armor lined the walls like silent sentries, ancestral portraits glowered from their frames. Everything whispered of centuries of power and bloodlines, everything she was not. "Mother!" Brogan appeared on the stairs, and Charlotte's breath caught at the sight of him here, in his natural habitat. He looked different, more commanding, somehow larger against the backdrop of stone and history. "Thank you for welcoming Miss Craig. I'll show her to her rooms." The Dowager's expression suggested this was highly irregular, but she merely inclined her head and swept away, leaving Charlotte feeling simultaneously relieved and more alone. "Don't let the place intimidate you," Brogan said softly as he guided her up the stone staircase. "It's just a very large, very drafty house with delusions of grandeur." But Charlotte could see the weight of it pressing on his shoulders, generations of expectations, the burden of a name older than nations. Could she truly belong here, among these ghosts of nobility? Her doubt must have shown, because after she'd freshened from the journey, Brogan took her hand with unusual solemnity. "Come with me. There's something I want you to see." He led her through corridors hung with tapestries, past the portrait gallery where stern-faced ancestors stared down in judgment, then to a library that stole Charlotte's breath, 3 stories of books reaching toward a painted ceiling, ladder rails gleaming in the firelight, the smell of old leather and secrets. "Oh," Charlotte breathed, turning slowly to take it all in. "Oh, Brogan." "My sanctuary," he said quietly. "When my father was alive, when the expectations became suffocating, I'd hide here for days. These books raised me more than any governess." Charlotte's fingers traced the spines, philosophy, poetry, novels in a dozen languages. She found Gothic romances tucked between Greek classics, subversive pamphlets hidden behind respectable histories. This wasn't just a collection, it was a portrait of the man behind the title. "There's more," Brogan said, and led her through a side door she hadn't noticed. The conservatory was a cathedral of glass and iron, exotic plants creating a jungle in the heart of the Highlands. But it was the corner studio that made Charlotte's heart clench. An easel, brushes and ceramic jars, paintings stacked against the walls. Landscapes mostly, rendered in confident strokes that captured the wild beauty of Scotland. "My grandmother," Brogan explained, his voice soft with old grief. "She died when I was 12. She used to let me sit here for hours while she painted,
and she'd tell me that titles were just costumes we wore, that the real measure of a person was what they created when no one was watching. He turned to Charlotte, and in his eyes she saw vulnerability that no ballroom had ever witnessed. "This is who I am, Charlotte, not the Duke in the Great Hall. This, the books, the paintings, the quiet spaces where titles don't matter. Can you see yourself here, not in the castle, but in these spaces with me?" Charlotte looked around at the conservatory filled with growing things, at the paintings that captured wild beauty without trying to tame it, at the man who'd brought her to his most private sanctuary. "Yes," she whispered, "I can."
Charlotte couldn't sleep. The castle room was magnificent, all velvet curtains and carved oak, but too vast, too full of the weight of history pressing down. Near midnight, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and wandered the corridors, drawn by some instinct she couldn't name. The conservatory glowed like a lantern in the darkness, moonlight streaming through the glass panels and turning the exotic planets into silver-limbed mysteries. She pushed open the door and stopped. Brogan stood among the ferns and night-blooming flowers, still fully dressed despite the late hour, staring out at the loch beyond. He turned at the sound of her entrance, and something in his expression made her heart stutter. "I hoped you'd come," he said quietly. "I've been standing here for an hour, trying to find the right words." Words for what? But Charlotte's voice trembled, because somehow, impossibly, she already knew. Brogan crossed to her, taking both her hands in his. The moonlight carved shadows beneath his cheekbones, made his dark eyes luminous. "I've spent my entire adult life being told what I should want. A young bride who'd give me heirs, a perfect duchess who'd ornament my title and never challenge me, someone beautiful and biddable and utterly forgettable." His grip tightened on her hands, as if afraid she might vanish. "And then I saw you, standing in that ballroom like you were carved from something stronger than marble. While everyone else performed their carefully rehearsed roles, you simply existed, dignified and defiant, and absolutely real. Charlotte, you are everything I didn't know I was searching for." "Brogan," Charlotte's voice broke. "Let me finish, please." He drew a shaking breath. "Not despite your 40 years, because of them. Because of every experience that shaped you into this extraordinary woman, every heartbreak that gave you depth, every year of enduring cruelty that somehow didn't make you cruel, every season you refused to disappear, even when society wished you would." Tears spilled down Charlotte's cheeks, silver tracks in the moonlight. "I don't want a girl who sees a title and a fortune. I want the woman who looked at me and saw a man, lonely and tired of performing and desperate for something authentic. I want your strength, your intelligence, your refusal to be anything less than yourself." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. "I want you, Charlotte Craig. Every year, every scar, every magnificent piece of who you are." The ring nestled in the box was a sapphire, deep blue as the highland sky at dusk, surrounded by small diamonds that caught the moonlight like captured stars. "This was my grandmother's," Brogan said, his voice rough with emotion. "The woman who taught me that worth has nothing to do with what society values. She'd have loved you, your courage, your grace, the way you refused to apologize for taking up space in the world." He dropped to one knee on the conservatory floor, among the exotic blooms and silver light, and Charlotte felt her entire world realign around this moment. "Marry me, Charlotte, not because society expects it, not because of duty or title or any of the reasons people marry in our world, but because my soul recognized yours the moment I saw you. Because I want to spend the rest of my life proving that you are exactly, perfectly, magnificently enough." Charlotte looked down at this powerful man kneeling before her,
offering not just a title or fortune, but himself, vulnerable and honest and impossibly, wonderfully real. She thought of 20 years of being told she wasn't enough, of believing love had passed her by, of learning to armor her heart against hope. And then she let the armor fall away. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Brogan, 1,000 times yes." He rose and slipped the ring on her finger, then pulled her into his arms with a fierceness that spoke of barely contained emotion. When he kissed her, their first kiss, tender and desperate and full of promise, Charlotte tasted salt from tears she couldn't tell were hers or his. Outside, the Highland moon watched over Ravensmore Castle, witness to the moment a 40-year-old spinster became exactly what she'd always been, worthy of everything.
The engagement announcement hit Edinburgh like a lightning strike. The Edinburgh Observer ran the news on the front page: Duke of Ravensmore to wed Miss Charlotte Craig. The scandal sheets erupted with speculation, disbelief, and in some quarters, grudging admiration. Charlotte read the reports over breakfast at Ravensmore, Brogan's grandmother's sapphire glinting on her finger, and felt nothing. No anxiety, no shame, no desperate need for society's approval. She'd spent 40 years craving acceptance from people who'd never truly seen her. Now, held in the regard of the one person whose opinion mattered, Edinburgh's whispers seemed as insignificant as wind through empty rooms. "They're calling you revolutionary," Margaret wrote in a breathless letter. "Lady Ashford looks positively ill every time your name is mentioned. Half the older unmarried ladies in Scotland are suddenly being reconsidered by gentlemen who thought them past their prime. Charlotte, you've changed everything." But Charlotte hadn't set out to change anything. She'd simply stopped apologizing for existing. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in Ravensmore's ancient chapel, a small stone sanctuary that had witnessed 3 centuries of Walker family vows. No grand society spectacle, just family, close friends, and the weight of genuine feeling. Charlotte wore cream silk and carried Highland heather. Brogan's hands trembled as he slipped the wedding band beside his grandmother's ring. "I see you," he whispered as they knelt before the altar. "Every magnificent part of you." "I see you too," Charlotte replied, and meant it with her entire soul. The Dowager Duchess wept, whether from joy or resignation, Charlotte never quite determined. But later, at the intimate wedding breakfast, the older woman took Charlotte's hand with something almost like warmth. "My son has never looked at anyone the way he looks at you. Perhaps I was wrong about what he needed." It was as close to an apology as Charlotte would ever receive, and found herself surprised to discover it was enough. 3 years later, Charlotte walked through Ravensmore's gardens with a small hand clasped in hers. Her daughter, Genevieve, Margaret Walker, named for both grandmothers, had just turned 2, all dark curls and her father's intense eyes, and an imperious personality that suggested she'd inherited the best of both bloodlines. "Mama, flowers!" Genevieve demanded, pointing at the roses climbing the garden wall. Charlotte smiled, lifting her daughter to smell the blooms. Beyond the gardens, the castle rose against the Highland sky, no longer cold or intimidating, but home. She transformed the conservatory into a studio where she painted, finally claiming the artistic education she'd been denied at 20. The library held her own growing collection now, Gothic novels shelved proudly beside Brogan's philosophy texts. "Tell me the story," Genevieve said, as she did every evening, "about the ball." "Once upon a time," Charlotte began, settling onto a stone bench with her daughter in her lap, "there was a woman who thought her story was over. She'd spent 20 years being told she wasn't enough, not young enough, not beautiful enough, not valuable enough. She believed them, and that belief was a kind of death." Genevieve listened with the solemn attention only small children can manage. But then a man saw her, really saw her, and everything changed. Not because he saved her, but because he reminded her that she'd never needed saving. She'd always been enough. She'd just been waiting for someone brave enough to recognize it. And then
Genevieve prompted, though she knew the ending by heart. And then she discovered that love, real love, sees the soul, not the season. That worth isn't measured in years, but in courage, in authenticity, in the refusal to disappear even when the world wishes you would. Charlotte pressed a kiss to her daughter's dark curls. She became not just a duchess, but living proof that no woman's story is over until she decides it is. Brogan appeared in the garden archway, still handsome, still intense, still looking at Charlotte as if she were the answer to every question he'd ever asked. "There are my girls." Genevieve squealed and ran to her father. Charlotte rose more slowly, taking in the scene, her family, her home, her impossible, extraordinary life. She'd spent 40 years as society's cautionary tale. Now she was something far more dangerous, their revolution. And as Brogan took her hand, pulling her close while their daughter laughed between them, Charlotte Cragg Walker, Duchess of Ravensmore, finally understood what she'd been waiting for all along. Not rescue, not validation, just this, the radical act of being loved for exactly who she was. The story hadn't been over. It had simply been waiting to begin.